The Story That Wrote Itself by A.M. Melfa. Copyright 2020. Dedication from Aurelia Figueria Boehm, my biggest and only fan. Chapter 1. It was a writer's dream. Never in his 40-odd years of penning paperbacks had a story flown onto the page with such unthinking ease. Characters leapt into the fray, fully realized and ready to dazzle. Plot points appeared as brightly lit signs along the narrative highway, establishing a breakneck yet flawless momentum. Every notion, once researched, ended up fitting into place like a perfectly turned puzzle piece. Initially, the sensation was exciting, enticing, but the marked lack of normal ortholy obstructions was decidedly eerie. Eustace Willard Gray should have been elated, but instead, a creeping sense of dismay began to insinuate itself into the awkward twists of the moist labyrinth that his consciousness called home. In a stilted version of call and response, the voice of his self-styled sainted mother, thankfully dead decades since, arrived on the wings of a particularly potent auditory hallucination. Whistling through the whispered wings of her habitually high-pitched screech, his mother's ghost harangued him. Eustace! If it seems too good to be true, then it is. No, probably. All about it. He and Dr. Hendricks had dedicated long, grueling hours. Hours which ran into days. Days which ran into months. Months which ran into years attempting to dislodge the despised sibilance of his overbearing maternal progenitor from his psyche. The ping-pong of her wretched harpy wail between his ears was always the first sign that something was wrong with him at a level deeper than Eustace was prepared to admit. Eleanor Gretchen Gray was a stern, proud woman who claimed her patent superiority was born of her direct descendancy from the historically significant Gray family of Tudor fame. Stemming from the genetic link to that unfortunate 15-day queen, the Lady Jane Grey, Eleanor felt it her lifelong responsibility to restore honor to the family name. She proceeded to effect this shift by adopting a demeanor so fierce, so adamantine, as to chase away any and all persons who made the grave mistake of attempting to love her. Eustace's father, one George Montgomery Willard, was an early casualty in Eleanor's war of attrition. After being drawn in, siren-like, by Eleanor's long, lean, yet dangerously sharp profile, the man was squeezed out of her aura like an offending splinter mere weeks after meeting, then disastrously impregnating her. Eustace had never once met or even corresponded with his father. The sad truth of the tragedy being that Eleanor would destroy any missive or gift that the ousted papa ever attempted to send to his known yet unknown son. Caught between the rock of his mother and the hard place that was his absentee father, Eustace grew up distorted by the impossible effort of pushing through those warped, stingy cracks. Eleanor was as beautiful to the eye as she was frightening to the soul. Topping 6 feet and slender as a willow, her hair had turned a fine gleaming silver before Eustace was old enough to know any color by name. Her impossibly pale blue eyes at once froze and burned, as if her line of sight was a laser capable of perfect dissection. Her figure was lithe and comely, her intellect was fearsome, and her charm was of the cobra variety. Eleanor Gretchen Gray was the flame that consumed many a hapless creature in its incendiary orbit. Eleanor lorded over her child, the sole subject of her domain, and brutally cut him to fit the mold she had cast. Eustace would never do a day's hard, honest labor in his henpecked life. Eustace would be a man of letters. Eustace would receive the finest schooling, American Ivy League only, if the greater British institutions failed to comprehend his genius, which, it turns out, they did not. Eustace being the lone American in his Oxford graduating class. And finally, Eustace would engage in the pursuit of gentleman author. Eleanor Gray would brook nothing less than a life of the mind for her ideal construction of a son. Eleanor had departed this life some 20 years past, firmly seated at the tail end of her prime. It seemed she had fatally choked on a piece of bread one morning while Eustace was out for his maternally enforced constitutional. It was dry toast and bare, naked tea each morning for his mother. On this particularly blessed dawn, a small morsel of dry crust had won the day by catching in her hateful gullet and asphyxiating the remorseless hag. Upon returning home from his walk, Eustace stared blankly for an unknown length of time at the lifeless carcass that had once been his mother, now describing a convoluted arc set against the flat expanse of the spotless cook stove door. An unseemly burst of giggling commenced, followed by an ecstatic jig across the saltillo-tiled floor, while his mother's shattered china teacup conjured an expanse of gorgeous Pollock-esque liberation. Eustace! If it seems too good to be true, then it is. Eustace snapped back into the here and now, resurfacing above the roiling tidal suck that was his dead mother's voice. He shook his head and pushed back from his computer desk. An uncomfortable tinnitus vibrated his eardrums at a pitch just below hearing, causing him to shake his head again and again like a dog dislodging fleas. He sighed, knowing Eleanor's interruption had once again dammed the floodgates of his inspiration. Frustrated, he reached out to shut down his laptop, but stopped short, pointer finger trembling in a goo above the appropriate key. The black cursor blinked, languid, all innocence, at the tail end of a stanza he had no recollection of writing. Besides, he was writing fiction, not poetry. Eustace read the words, and then again, and again, once more, just to be sure that what he was seeing was really and truly there. Third time being the proverbial charm. The rogue lines read as follows. Some 20 years, I think, are gone. Time flies I know not how, anyway. The sun upon no happier shone, nor prouder man than Eustace Gray. Huh, he thought. What do you know about that? The answer from his brain was, nothing! I know nothing about that! At the epicenter of his cochlea, the tinnitus was morphing back into Eleanor's cotton-covered squealing. No! Eustace bellowed as he jumped up, knocking over his work chair. No, 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 he screamed, pressing his palms flat against his ears. Suddenly, Dr. Hendrick's voice was replacing the Eleanor tea kettle squeal, which was threatening to amp up to 11. The calm voice of his esteemed therapist gently reminded him to breathe. Breathe, Eustace. Just breathe. Soon he was doing just that, breathing. At first in big, hungry gulps, then slowing to sedate, measured sips. When the panic subsided, Eustace sidled cautiously back in the direction of the laptop, still gaping open, with its sinister cursor broadcasting a blinking semaphore. You're blink, crazy, blink. You're crazy, blink. You blink are blink, crazy, blink, blink, blink. Consciously commanding himself to maintain the measured breathing, Eustace came close enough for his bespectacled eyes to focus on the stanza, its reluctance to disappear now causing a mild nausea to rise. Breathing, Yet unaware of his frantic hands twisting his favorite sweater out of True, he read the words again. And then Eustace Willard Gray let out a laugh, and relief followed on its coattails. Oh, some 20 years are gone. That was the telltale. Of course, he had been thinking of Mother, of that day he found her murdered by toast. He stopped and reflected for a moment on the words his brain had selected at seeming random. Murdered by toast. He laughed again. Oh, funny. In a very base way. And Eustace was much more willing to engage in base behavior and thoughts these past 20 blessed Eleanor-less years. It was as simple as that. He had been reliving his mother's death, and while his brain was thus occupied in a rewind loop, his fingers tapped out a small accompaniment. Eustace tisked and tittered at himself and his nervous disposition as he saved his miraculous too-good-to-be-true story and carefully closed the laptop. He straightened his desk, neatening all into right-angled piles, OCD being another inheritance from his sainted mother, then walked into the kitchen and began preparing dinner for himself and his husband, Claude, who would be home soon from his high-stress tech job. Staring at the clinically clean stove front, he saw a body curled into the shape of a comma lying just below its glittering facade, and finished the sentence that the haint of his mother had begun. If it seems too good to be true, then it is. End of chapter 1.